Ah, take care, exclaimed Negoro. You are not alone here. Your child is like you in my power, and I well know how. Mrs. Weldon wished to reply that that would be impossible. Her heart was beating as if it would break. She was voiceless. Mrs. Weldon, said Negoro, you will reflect on the offer I have made you. In 8 days you will have handed me a letter to James Weldon's address, or you will repent of it. That said, the Portuguese retired, without giving vent to his anger. But it was easy to see that nothing would stop him from constraining Mrs. Weldon to obey him. Chapter 14. Some news of Dr. Livingstone. Left alone, Mrs. Weldon at first only fixed her mind on this thought, that 8 days would pass before Negoro would return for a definite answer. There was time to reflect and decide on a course of action. There could be no question of the Portuguese's probity, except in his own interest. The market value that he attributed to his prisoner would evidently be a safeguard for her, and protect her for the time, at least, against any temptation that might put her in danger. Perhaps she would think of a compromise that would restore her to her husband without obliging Mr. Weldon to come to Cazond. On receipt of a letter from his wife, she well knew that James Weldon would set out. He would brave the perils of this journey into the most dangerous countries of Africa. But once at Cazond, when Negoro should have that fortune of $100,000 in his hands, what guarantee would James W. Weldon, his wife, his son, and cousin Benedict have that they would be allowed to depart? Could not Queen Moynie's caprice prevent them? Would not this sale of Mrs. Weldon and hers be better accomplished if it took place at the coast, at some point agreed upon, which would spare Mr. Weldon both the dangers of the journey to the interior and the difficulties, not to say the impossibilities, of a return? So reflected Mrs. Weldon. That was why she had refused at once to accede to Negoro's proposition and give him a letter for her husband. She also thought that, if Negoro had put off his second visit for 8 days, it was because he needed that time to prepare for his journey. If not, he would return sooner to force her consent. Would he really separate me from my child? Murmured she. At that moment Jack entered the hut, and, by an instinctive movement, his mother seized him, as if Negoro were there, ready to snatch him from her. You are in great grief, mother? Asked the little boy. No, dear Jack, replied Mrs. Weldon. I was thinking of your papa. You would be very glad to see him again. Oh, yes, mother, is he going to come? No, no, he must not come. Then we will go to see him again. Yes, darling Jack. With my friend Dick and Hercules and old Tom. Yes, yes, replied Mrs. Weldon, putting her head down to hide her tears. Has Papa written to you? Asked little Jack. No, my love. Then you are going to write to him, mother. Yes, yes, perhaps, replied Mrs. Weldon. And without knowing it, little Jack entered directly into his mother's thoughts. To avoid answering him further, she covered him with kisses. It must be stated that another motive of some value was joined to the different reasons that had urged Mrs. Weldon to resist Negoro's injunctions. Perhaps Mrs. Weldon had a very unexpected chance of being restored to liberty without her husband's intervention, and even against Negoro's will. It was only a faint ray of hope, very vague as yet, but it was one. In fact, a few words of conversation, overheard by her several days before, made her foresee a possible succor near at hand. One might say a providential succor. Alves and a mongrel from Aujiji were talking a few steps from the hut occupied by Mrs. Weldon. It is not astonishing that the slave trade was the subject of conversation between those worthy merchants. The two brokers in human flesh were talking business. They were discussing the future of their commerce, and were worried about the efforts the English were making to destroy it, not only on the exterior, by cruisers, but in the interior, by their missionaries and their travelers. José Antonio Alves found that the explorations of these hardy pioneers could only injure commercial operations. His interlocutor shared his views and thought that all these visitors, civil or religious, should be received with gunshots. This had been done to some extent, but to the great displeasure of the traders, if they killed some of these curious ones, others escaped them. Now, these latter, on returning to their country, recounted with exaggerations. Alves said the horrors of the slave trade, and that injured this commerce immensely, it being too much diminished already. The mongrel agreed to that and deplored it, above all, concerning the markets of Nyangwe, of Aujiji, of Zanzibar, and of all the Great Lake regions. there had come successively Speke, Grant, Livingstone, Stanley, and others. It was an invasion. Soon all England and all America would occupy the country. Alves sincerely pitied his comrade, and he declared that the provinces of Western Africa had been, till that time, less badly treated, that is to say, less visited. But the epidemic of travelers was beginning to spread. If Cazond had been spared, it was not so with Cassinge and with Bith, where Alves owned factories. It may be remembered also that Harris had spoken to Negoro of a certain Lieutenant Cameron, who might indeed have the presumption to cross Africa from one side to the other, and after entering it by Zanzibar, leave it by Angola. In fact, the trader had reason to fear, and we know that, some years after, Cameron to the south and Stanley to the north, were going to explore these little-known provinces of the West, describe the permanent monstrosities of the trade, unveil the guilty complicities of foreign agents, and make the responsibility fall on the right parties. Neither Alves nor the mongrel could know anything yet of this exploration of Cameron's and of Stanley's, but what they did know, what they said, what Mrs. Weldon heard, and what was of such great interest to her. In a word, what had sustained her in her refusal to subscribe at once to Negoro's demands was this. Before long, very probably, Dr. David Livingstone would arrive at Cazonde. Now, the arrival of Livingstone with his escort, the influence which the great traveler enjoyed in Africa, the concourse of Portuguese authorities from Angola that could not fail to meet him, all that might bring about the deliverance of Mrs. Weldon and hers, in spite of Negoro, in spite of Alves. It was perhaps their restoration to their country within a short time, and without James W. Weldon risking his life in a journey, the result of which could only be deplorable. But was there any probability that Dr. Livingstone would soon visit that part of the continent? Yes, for in following that missionary tour, he was going to complete the exploration of Central Africa. We know the heroic life of the son of the tea merchant, who lived in Blantyre, a village in the county of Lanark. Born on the 13th of March, 1813, David Livingstone, the second of 6 children, became, by force of study, both a theologian and doctor. After making his novitiate in the London Missionary Society, he embarked for the Cape in 1840, with the intention of joining the missionary Moffat in southern Africa. From the Cape, the future traveler repaired to the country of the Bechuanas, which he explored for the first time, returned to Kuruman and married Moffat's daughter, that brave companion who would be worthy of him. In 1843, he founded a mission in the valley of the Mabotsa. 4 years later, we find him established at Kalobeng, 225 miles to the north of Kuruman, in the country of the Bechuanas. 2 years after, in 1849, Livingstone left Kalobeng with his wife, his 3 children and 2 friends, Messrs. Oswell and Murray. August 1st of the same year, he discovered Lake Ngami and returned to Kalobeng by descending the Zauga. In this journey, Livingstone, stopped by the bad will of the natives, had not passed beyond the Ngami. A second attempt was not more fortunate. A third must succeed. Then, taking a northern route, again with his family and Mr. Oswell, after frightful sufferings, for lack of food, for lack of water that almost cost him the lives of his children, he reached the country of the Makalolos beside the Chobe, a branch of the Zambezi. The chief, Sebituin, joined him at Linianti. At the end of June, 1851, the Zambezi was discovered, and the doctor returned to the Cape to bring his family to England. In fact, the intrepid Livingstone wished to be alone, while risking his life in the daring journey he was going to undertake. On leaving the Cape this time, the question was to cross Africa obliquely from the south to the west, so as to reach St. Paul de Londe. On the 3rd of June, 1852, the doctor set out with a few natives. He arrived at Kuruman and skirted the desert of Kalahari, the 31st. December he entered Litoubarauba and found the country of the Bechuanas ravaged by the Boers, old Dutch colonists who were masters of the Cape before the English took possession of it. Livingstone left Litoubarauba on the 15th of January, 1853, penetrated to the center of the country of the Bamangwatos, and on May 23d, he arrived at Linianti, where the young sovereign of the Makalolos, Esikeletu, received him with great honor. There, the doctor, held back by the intense fevers, devoted himself to studying the manners of the country, and, for the first time, he could ascertain the ravages made by the slave trade in Africa. 1 month after he descended the Chobe, reached the Zambezi, entered Naniel, visited Kadanga and Libonta, arrived at the confluence of the Zambezi and the Liba, formed the project of ascending by that watercourse as far as the Portuguese possessions of the west, and after 9 weeks' absence, returned to Linianti to make preparations. On the 11th of November, 1853, the doctor, accompanied by 27 Macalalos, left Linianti, and on the 27th of December he reached the mouth of the Liba. This watercourse was ascended as far as the territory of the Balandas, there where it receives the Maconda, which comes from the east. It was the first time that a white man penetrated into this region. January 14th, Livingstone entered Shint's residence. He was the most powerful sovereign of the Balandas. He gave Livingstone a good reception, and the 26th of the same month, after crossing the Liba, he arrived at King Caitma's. There, again, a good reception, and thence the departure of the little troop that on the 20th of February encamped on the borders of Lake Dilolo. On setting out from this point, a difficult country, exigencies of the natives, attacks from the tribes, revolt of his companions, threats of death, everything conspired against Livingstone, and a less energetic man would have abandoned the party. The doctor persevered, and on the 4th of April, he reached the banks of the Congo, a large watercourse which forms the eastern boundary of the Portuguese possessions and flows northward into the Zaire. 6 days after, Livingstone entered Cassinge, where the trader Alves had seen him passing through, and on the 31st of May he arrived at St. Paul de Londa. For the first time, and after a journey of 2 years, Africa had just been crossed obliquely from the south to the west. David Livingstone left Londa, September 24th of the same year. He skirted the right bank of that Konza that had been so fatal to Dick Sand and his party, arrived at the confluence of the Lam, crossing numerous caravans of slaves, passed by Cassinge again, left it on the 20th of February, crossed the Congo, and reached the Zambezi at Kawawa. On the 8th of June he discovered Lake Dilolo again, saw Shint again, descended the Zambezi, and re-entered Linianti, which he left on the 3d of November, 1855. This second part of the journey, which would lead the doctor toward the eastern coast, would enable him to finish completely this crossing of Africa from the west to the east. After having visited the famous Victoria Falls, the thundering foam, David Livingstone abandoned the Zambezi to take a northeastern direction. The passage across the territory of the Batokas, natives who were besotted by the inhalation of hemp, the visit to Semilmbone, the powerful chief of the region, the crossing of the Kafone, the finding of the Zambezi again, the visit to King Mbaroma, the site of the ruins of Zambo, an ancient Portuguese city, the encounter with the chief Mpend on the 17th of January, 1856, then at war with the Portuguese, the final arrival at Teat, on the border of the Zambezi, on the 2d of March. Such were the principal halting places of this tour. The 22d of April Livingstone left that station, formerly a rich one, descended as far as the delta of the river, and arrived at Quillimane, at its mouth, on the 20th of May, 4 years after leaving the Cape. On the 12th of July he embarked for Morris, and on the 22d of December he was returning to England, after 16 years' absence. The prize of the Geographical Society of Paris, the Grand Medal of the London Geographical Society, and brilliant receptions greeted the illustrious traveler. Another would, perhaps, have thought that repose was well earned. The doctor did not think so, and departed on the 1st of March, 1858, accompanied by his brother Charles, Captain Bedinfield, the doctors, Kirk and Meller, and by Messrs. Thornton and Baines. He arrived in May on the coast of Mozambique, having for an object the exploration of the basin of the Zambezi. All would not return from this voyage. A little steamer, the My Robert, enabled the explorers to ascend the great river by the Rongan. They arrived at Teat, September the 8th. Thence reconnaissance of the lower course of the Zambezi and of the Kaira, its left branch, in January, 1859. Visit to Lake Kairona in April. Exploration of the Manganyas territory. Discovery of Lake Nyassa on September 10th. Return to the Victoria Falls, August 9, 1860. Arrival of Bishop Mackenzie and his missionaries at the mouth of the Zambezi, January 31st, 1861. The exploration of the Ravoma on the Pioneer in March. The return to Lake Nyassa in September, 1861, and residence there till the end of October. January 30th, 1862, arrival of Mrs. Livingstone and a second steamer, the Lady Nyassa. Such were the events that marked the first years of this new expedition. At this time, Bishop Mackenzie and one of his missionaries had already succumbed to the unhealthfulness of the climate, and on the 27th of April, Mrs. Livingstone died in her husband's arms. In May, the doctor attempted a second reconnaissance of the Ravoma. Then, at the end of November, he entered the Zambezi again and sailed up the Cairo again. In April 1863, he lost his companion, Thornton, sent back to Europe his brother Charles and Dr. Kirk, who were both exhausted by sickness, and November 10th, for the third time, he saw Nyassa, of which he completed the hydrography. 3 months after he was again at the mouth of the Zambezi, passed to Zanzibar, and July 20th, 1864, after 5 years' absence, he arrived in London, where he published his work entitled Exploration of the Zambezi and its Branches. January 28th, 1866, Livingstone landed again at Zanzibar. He was beginning his fourth voyage. August 8th, after having witnessed the horrible scenes provoked by the slave trade in that country, the doctor, taking this time only a few Sipes and a few Negroes, found himself again at Mokalayas, on the banks of the Nyassa. 6 weeks later, the majority of the men forming the escort took flight, returned to Zanzibar, and there falsely spread the report of Livingstone's death. He, however, did not draw back. He wished to visit the country comprised between the Nyassa and Lake Tanganyika. December 10th, guided by some natives, he traversed the Longona River, and Apid, 1867, he discovered Lake Limba. There he remained a month between life and death. Hardly well again, August 30th, he reached Lake Moero, of which he visited the northern shore, and November 21st, he entered the town of Cayambe, where he lived 40 days, during which he twice renewed his exploration of Lake Moero. From Cayambe, Livingstone took a northern direction, with the design of reaching the important town of Aujiji on the Tanganyika. Surprised by the rising of the waters and abandoned by his guides, he was obliged to return to Cayambe. He redescended to the south June 6th, and 6 weeks after gained the great Lake Banganyolo. He remained there till August 9th, and then sought to reascend toward Lake Tanganyika. What a journey! On setting out, January 7th, 1869, the heroic doctor's feebleness was such that he had to be carried. In February, he at last reached the lake and arrived at Aujiji, where he found some articles sent to his address by the Oriental Company of Calcutta. Livingstone then had but one idea: to gain the sources of the valley of the Nile by ascending the Tanganyika. September 21st, he was at Bambar in the Maniema, a cannibal country, and arrived at the Lualaba that Cameron was going to suspect and Stanley to discover to be only the Upper Zaire or Congo. At Mamohela, the doctor was sick for 80 days. He had only 3 servants. July 21st, 1871, he departed again for the Tanganyika and only re-entered Aujiji October 23d. He was then a mere skeleton. Meanwhile, before this period, people had been a long time without news of the traveler. In Europe, they believed him to be dead. He himself had almost lost hope of being ever relieved. 11 days after his entrance into Aujiji, shots were heard a quarter of a mile from the lake. The doctor arrives. A white man, is before him. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? Yes, replied the latter, raising his cap with a friendly smile. Their hands were warmly clasped. I thank God, continued the white man, that he has permitted me to meet you. I am happy, said Livingstone, to be here to receive you. The white man was the American Stanley, a reporter of the New York Herald, whom Mr. Bennett, the proprietor of that journal, had just sent to find David Livingstone. In the month of October, 1870, this American, without hesitation, without a word, simply as a hero, had embarked at Bombay for Zanzibar, and almost following Speke and Burton's route, after untold sufferings, his life being menaced several times, he arrived at Aujiji. The two travelers, now become fast friends, then made an expedition to the north of Lake Tanganyika. They embarked, pushed as far as Cape Malaya, and after a minute exploration, were of the opinion that the Great Lake had for an outlet a branch of the Lualaba. It was what Cameron and Stanley himself were going to determine positively some years after. December 12th, Livingstone and his companion were returning to Aujiji. Stanley prepared to depart. December 27th, after a navigation of 8 days, the doctor and he arrived at Ausimba. Then, February 23d, they entered Kuihara. March 12th was the day of parting. You have accomplished, said the doctor to his companion, what few men would have done, and done it much better than certain great travelers. I am very grateful to you for it. May God lead you, my friend, and may he bless you. May he, said Stanley, taking Livingstone's hand, bring you back to us safe and sound, dear doctor. Stanley drew back quickly from this embrace and turned so as to conceal his tears. "Goodbye, doctor, dear friend," he said in a stifled voice. "Goodbye," replied Livingstone feebly. Stanley departed, and July 12, 1872, he landed at Marseille. Livingstone was going to return to his discoveries. August 25th, after 5 months passed at Kanahara, accompanied by his black servants, Susie, Chuma, and Amoda, by 2 other servants, by Jacob Wainwright, and by 56 men sent by Stanley, he went toward the south of the Tanganyika. A month after, the caravan arrived at 1,000 Ara, in the midst of storms caused by an extreme drought. Then came the rains, the bad will of the natives, and the loss of the beasts of burden from falling under the stings of the tsetse. January 24th, 1873, the little troop was at Tichitoncone. Apith, after having left Lake Banganyolo to the east, the troop was going toward the village of Tichitambo. At that place some traders had left Livingstone. This is what Alves and his colleague had learned from them. They had good reason to believe that the doctor, after exploring the south of the lake, would venture across the Londa and come to seek unknown countries in the west. Thence he was to ascend toward Angola, to visit those regions infested by the slave trade, to push as far as Kazonde. The tour seemed to be all marked out, and it was very probable that Livingstone would follow it. Mrs. Weldon then could count on the approaching arrival of the great traveler, because, in the beginning of June, it was already more than 2 months since he had reached the south of Lake Banganyolo. Now, June 13th, the day before that on which Negoro would come to claim from Mrs. Weldon the letter that would put $100,000 in his hands, sad news was spread, at which Alves and the traders only rejoiced. May 1st, 1873, at dawn, Dr. David Livingstone died. In fact, on Apith, the little caravan had reached the village of Tichitambo, to the south of the lake. The doctor was carried there on a litter. On the 30th, in the night, under the influence of excessive grief, he moaned out this complaint that was hardly heard. "Oh, dear, dear," and he fell back from drowsiness. At the end of an hour, he called his servant, Susie, asking for some medicine, then murmuring in a feeble voice, "It is well. Now you can go." Toward 4 o'clock in the morning, Susie and 5 men of the escort entered the doctor's hut. David Livingstone, kneeling near his bed, his head resting on his hands, seemed to be engaged in prayer. Susie gently touched his cheek. It was cold. David Livingstone was no more. 9 months after, his body, carried by faithful servants at the price of unheard-of fatigues, arrived at Zanzibar. On Apith, 1874, it was buried in Westminster Abbey, among those of her great men, whom England honors equally with her kings. Chapter 15. Where a manticore may laid. To what plank of safety will not an unfortunate being cling? Will not the eyes of the condemned seek to seize any ray of hope, no matter how vague? So it had been with Mrs. Weldon. One can understand what she must have felt when she learned, from Alves himself, that Dr. Livingstone had just died in a little Banganyolo village. It seemed to her that she was more isolated than ever, that a sort of bond that attached her to the traveler, and with him to the civilized world, had just been broken. The plank of safety sank under her hand, the ray of hope went out before her eyes. Tom and his companions had left Kazonde for the lake region, not the least news of Hercules. Mrs. Weldon was not sure of anyone. She must then fall back on Negoro's proposition, while trying to amend it and secure a definite result from it. June 14th, the day fixed by him, Negoro presented himself at Mrs. Weldon's hut. The Portuguese was, as always, so he said, perfectly practical. However, he abated nothing from the amount of the ransom, which his prisoner did not even discuss. But Mrs. Weldon also showed herself very practical in saying to him, "If you wish to make an agreement, do not render it impossible by unacceptable conditions. The exchange of our liberty for the sum you exact may take place, without my husband coming into a country where you see what can be done with a white man. Now, I do not wish him to come here at any price." After some hesitation, Negoro yielded, and Mrs. Weldon finished with the concession that James Weldon should not venture as far as Kazonde. A ship would land him at Mossames, a little port to the south of Angola, ordinarily frequented by slave ships, and well known by Negoro. It was there that the Portuguese would conduct James W. Weldon, and at a certain time, Alves's agent would bring thither Mrs. Weldon, Jack, and cousin Benedict. The ransom would be given to those agents on the giving up of the prisoners, and Negoro, who would play the part of a perfectly honest man with James Weldon, would disappear on the ship's arrival. Mrs. Weldon had gained a very important point. She spared her husband the dangers of a voyage to Cazond, the risk of being kept there, after paying the exacted ransom, and the perils of the return. As to the 600 miles that separated Cazond from Mossames, by going over them as she had traveled on leaving the Conza, Mrs. Weldon would only have a little fatigue to fear. Besides, it would be to Alves's interest, for he was in the affair, for the prisoners to arrive safe and sound. The conditions being thus settled, Mrs. Weldon wrote to her husband, leaving to Negoro the care of passing himself off as a devoted servant who had escaped from the natives. Negoro took the letter, which did not allow James Weldon to hesitate about following him as far as Mossames, and the next day, escorted by 20 blacks, he traveled toward the north. Why did he take that direction? Was it, then, Negoro's intention to embark on one of the vessels which frequent the mouths of the Congo, and thus avoid the Portuguese stations, as well as the penitentiaries in which he had been an involuntary guest? It was probable. At least, that was the reason he gave Alves. After his departure, Mrs. Weldon must try to arrange her existence in such a manner as to pass the time of her sojourn at Cazond as happily as possible. Under the most favorable circumstances, it would last 3 or 4 months. Negoro's going and returning would require at least that time. Mrs. Weldon's intention was not to leave the factory. Her child, cousin Benedict, and she were comparatively safe there. Halima's good care softened the severity of the sequestration a little. Besides, it was probable that the trader would not permit her to leave the establishment. The great premium that the prisoner's ransom would procure him made it well worth while to guard her carefully. It was even fortunate that Alves was not obliged to leave Cazond to visit his 2 other factories of Bih and Cassinge. Coimbra was going to take his place in the expedition on new razzias or raids. There was no motive for regretting the presence of that drunkard. Above all, Negoro, before setting out, had given Alves the most urgent commands in regard to Mrs. Weldon. It was necessary to watch her closely. They did not know what had become of Hercules. If he had not perished in that dreadful province of Cazond, perhaps he would attempt to get near the prisoner and snatch her from Alves's hands. The trader perfectly understood a situation which ciphered itself out by a good number of dollars. He would answer for Mrs. Weldon as for his own body. So the monotonous life of the prisoner during the first days after her arrival at the factory was continued. What passed in this enclosure reproduced very exactly the various acts of native existence outside. Alves lived like the other natives of Cazond. The women of the establishment worked as they would have done in the town, for the greater comfort of their husbands or their masters. Their occupations included preparing rice with heavy blows of the pestle in wooden mortars, to perfect decortication, cleansing and winnowing maize, and all the manipulations necessary to draw from it a granulous substance which serves to compose that potage called mtail in the country. The harvesting of the sorgho, a kind of large millet, the ripening of which had just been solemnly celebrated at this time. The extraction of that fragrant oil from the empaphon, drupes, kinds of olives, the essence of which forms a perfume sought for by the natives. Spinning of the cotton, the fibers of which are twisted by means of a spindle a foot and a half long, to which the spinners impart a rapid rotation. The fabrication of bark stuffs with the mallet, the extraction from the tapioca roots, and the preparation of the earth for the different products of the country, cassava, flour that they make from the manioc beans, of which the pods, 15 inches long, named mossitsanes, grow on trees 20 feet high. Arachides intended to make oil perennial peas of a bright blue, known under the name of tea chilobes, the flowers of which relieve the slightly insipid taste of the milk of sorgho. Native coffee, sugar canes, the juice of which is reduced to a syrup. Onions, Indian pears, sesamum, cucumbers, the seeds of which are roasted like chestnuts. The preparation of fermented drinks, the malafori, made with bananas, the pombe and other liquors. The care of the domestic animals, of those cows that only allow themselves to be milked in the presence of their little one or of a stuffed calf. Of those heifers of small race with short horns, some of which have a hump. Of those goats which, in the country where their flesh serves for food, are an important object of exchange, one might say current money like the slave. Finally, the feeding of the birds, swine, sheep, oxen, and so forth. This long enumeration shows what rude labors fall on the feeble sex in those savage regions of the African continent. During this time, the men smoke tobacco or hemp, chase the elephant or the buffalo, and hire themselves to the traders for the raids. The harvest of maize or of slaves is always a harvest that takes place in fixed seasons. Of those various occupations, Mrs. Weldon only saw in Alves's factory the part laid on the women. Sometimes she stopped, looking at them, while the slaves, it must be said, only replied to her by ugly grimaces. A race instinct led these unfortunates to hate a white woman, and they had no commiseration for her in their hearts. Halima alone was an exception, and Mrs. Weldon, having learned certain words of the native language, was soon able to exchange a few sentences with the young slave. Little Jack often accompanied his mother when she walked in the enclosure, but he wished very much to go outside. There was, however, in an enormous baobab, marabou nests formed of a few sticks, and suimangas nests, birds with scarlet breasts and throats which resemble those of the tisserms. Then widows that stripped the thatch for the benefit of their family. Calows, whose song was agreeable, bright gray parrots with red tails, which in the Maniema are called rouse and give their name to the chiefs of the tribes. Insectivorous dragos, similar to gray linnets with large red beaks. Here and there also fluttered hundreds of butterflies of different species, especially in the neighborhood of the brooks that crossed the factory. But that was rather Cousin Benedict's affair than little Jack's, and the latter regretted greatly not being taller, so as to look over the walls. Alas, where was his poor friend, Dick Sand, he who had brought him so high up in the Pilgrim's masts? How he would have followed him on the branches of those trees, whose tops rose to more than 100 feet. What good times they would have had together. Cousin Benedict always found himself very well where he was, provided insects were not lacking. Happily, he had discovered in the factory, and he studied as much as he could without magnifying glass or spectacles, a small bee which forms its cells among the wormholes of the wood, and a sphex that lays its eggs in cells that are not its own, as the cuckoo in the nests of other birds. Mosquitoes were not lacking either, on the banks of the rivulets, and they tattooed him with bites to the extent of making him unrecognizable. And when Mrs. Weldon reproached him with letting himself be thus devoured by those venomous insects, "It is their instinct, Cousin Weldon," he replied to her, scratching himself till the blood came. "It is their instinct, and we must not have a grudge against them." At last, one day, it was the 17th of June, Cousin Benedict was on the point of being the happiest of entomologists. But this adventure, which had unexpected consequences, needs to be related with some minuteness. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning. An overpowering heat had obliged the inhabitants of the factory to keep in their huts, and one would not even meet a single native in the streets of Kazonde. Mrs. Weldon was dozing near little Jack, who was sleeping soundly. Cousin Benedict, himself, suffering from the influence of this tropical temperature, had given up his favorite hunts, which was a great sacrifice for him, for, in those rays of the midday sun, he heard the rustle of a whole world of insects. He was sheltered then at the end of his hut, and there, sleep began to take possession of him in this involuntary siesta. Suddenly, as his eyes half closed, he heard a humming. This is one of those insupportable buzzings of insects, some of which can give 15 or 16,000 beats of their wings in a second. "A hexapode!" exclaimed Cousin Benedict, awakened at once, and passing from the horizontal to the vertical position. There was no doubt that it was a hexapode that was buzzing in his hut. But if Cousin Benedict was very nearsighted, he had at least very acute hearing, so acute even that he could recognize one insect from another by the intensity of its buzz, and it seemed to him that this one was unknown, though it could only be produced by a giant of the species. "What is this hexapode?" Cousin Benedict asked himself. Behold him, seeking to perceive the insect, which was very difficult to his eyes without glasses, but trying above all to recognize it by the buzzing of its wings. His instinct as an entomologist warned him that he had something to accomplish, and that the insect, so providentially entered into his hut, ought not to be the first comer. Cousin Benedict no longer moved. He listened. A few rays of light reached him. His eyes then discovered a large black point that flew about, but did not pass near enough for him to recognize it. He held his breath, and if he felt himself stung in some part of the face or hands, he was determined not to make a single movement that might put his hexapode to flight. At last the buzzing insect, after turning around him for a long time, came to rest on his head. Cousin Benedict's mouth widened for an instant, as if to give a smile, and what a smile! He felt the light animal running on his hair. An irresistible desire to put his hand there seized him for a moment, but he resisted it and did well. "No, no," thought he. "I would miss it, or what would be worse, I would injure it. Let it come more within my reach. See it walking, it descends. I feel its dear little feet running on my skull. This must be a hexapode of great height. My God, only grant that it may descend on the end of my nose, and there, by squinting a little, I might perhaps see it and determine to what order, genus, species, or variety it belongs." So thought Cousin Benedict, but it was a long distance from his skull, which was rather pointed, to the end of his nose, which was very long. How many other roads the capricious insect might take, beside his ears, beside his forehead. Roads that would take it to a distance from the savant's eyes, without counting that at any moment it might retake its flight, leave the hut, and lose itself in those solar rays where, doubtless, its life was past, and in the midst of the buzzing of its congeners that would attract it outside. Cousin Benedict said all that to himself. Never, in all his life as an entomologist, had he passed more touching minutes. An African hexapode of a new species, or, at least, of a new variety, or even of a new subvariety, was there on his head, and he could not recognize it except it deigned to walk at least an inch from his eyes. However, Cousin Benedict's prayer must be heard. The insect, after having traveled over the half-bald head, as on the summit of some wild bush, began to descend Cousin Benedict's forehead, and the latter might at last conceive the hope that it would venture to the top of his nose. Once arrived at that top, why would it not descend to the base? In its place I would descend, thought the worthy savant. What is truer than that, in Cousin Benedict's place, any other would have struck his forehead violently, so as to crush the enticing insect, or at least to put it to flight. To feel 6 feet moving on his skin, without speaking of the fear of being bitten, and not make a gesture, one will agree that it was the height of heroism. The Spartan allowing his breast to be devoured by a fox, the Roman holding burning coals between his fingers, were not more masters of themselves than Cousin Benedict, who was undoubtedly descended from those two heroes. After 20 little circuits, the insect arrived at the top of the nose. Then there was a moment's hesitation that made all Cousin Benedict's blood rush to his heart. Would the hexapode ascend again beyond the line of the eyes, or would it descend below? It descended. Cousin Benedict felt its caterpillar feet coming toward the base of his nose. The insect turned neither to the right nor to the left. It rested between its two buzzing wings, on the slightly hooked edge of that learned nose, so well formed to carry spectacles. It cleared the little furrow produced by the incessant use of that optical instrument, so much missed by the poor cousin, and it stopped just at the extremity of his nasal appendage. It was the best place this hexapode could choose. At that distance, Cousin Benedict's two eyes, by making their visual rays converge, could, like two lenses, dart their double look on the insect. Almighty God! Exclaimed Cousin Benedict, who could not repress a cry, the tuberculous manticore. Now, he must not cry it out, he must only think it. But was it not too much to ask from the most enthusiastic of entomologists? To have on the end of his nose a tuberculous manticore, with large elytrums, an insect of the Cicindelites tribe, a very rare specimen in collections, one that seems peculiar to those southern parts of Africa, and yet not utter a cry of admiration, that is beyond human strength. Unfortunately, the manticore heard this cry, which was almost immediately followed by a sneeze that shook the appendage on which it rested. Cousin Benedict wished to take possession of it, extended his hand, shut it violently, and only succeeded in seizing the end of his own nose. "Malediction!" exclaimed he, but then he showed a remarkable coolness. He knew that the tuberculous manticore only flutters about, so to say, that it walks rather than flies. He then knelt, and succeeded in perceiving, at less than 10 inches from his eyes, the black point that was gliding rapidly in a ray of light. Evidently, it was better to study it in this independent attitude, only he must not lose sight of it. To seize the manticore would be to risk crushing it, Cousin Benedict said to himself. No, I shall follow it, I shall admire it, I have time enough to take it. Was Cousin Benedict wrong? However that may be, see him now on all fours, his nose to the ground like a dog that smells a scent, and following 7 or 8 inches behind the superb hexapode. One moment after he was outside his hut, under the midday sun, and a few minutes later at the foot of the palisade that shut in Alves's establishment. At this place was the manticore going to clear the enclosure with a bound, and put a wall between its adorer and itself? No, that was not in its nature, and Cousin Benedict knew it well. So he was always there, crawling like a snake, too far off to recognize the insect entomologically. Besides, that was done, but near enough to perceive that large, moving point traveling over the ground. The manticore, arrived near the palisade, had met the large entrance of a molehill that opened at the foot of the enclosure. There, without hesitating, it entered this subterranean gallery, for it is in the habit of seeking those obscure passages. Cousin Benedict believed that he was going to lose sight of it. But to his great surprise, the passage was at least 2 feet high, and the molehill formed a gallery where his long, thin body could enter. Besides, he put the ardor of a ferret into his pursuit, and did not even perceive that, in earthing himself thus, he was passing outside the palisade. In fact, the molehill established a natural communication between the inside and the outside. In half a minute, Cousin Benedict was outside of the factory. That did not trouble him. He was absorbed in admiration of the elegant insect that was leading him on. But the latter, doubtless, had enough of this long walk. Its elytrums turned aside, its wings spread out. Cousin Benedict felt the danger, and with his curved hand, he was going to make a provisional prison for the manticore when, FRRRR, it flew away. What despair, but the manticore could not go far. Cousin Benedict rose, he looked, he darted forward, his two hands stretched out and open. The insect flew above his head, and he only perceived a large black point without appreciable form to him. Would the manticore come to the ground again to rest, after having traced a few capricious circles around Cousin Benedict's bald head? All the probabilities were in favor of its doing so. Unfortunately for the unhappy savant, this part of Alves's establishment, which was situated at the northern extremity of the town, bordered on a vast forest, which covered the territory of Cazonde for a space of several square miles. If the manticore gained the cover of the trees, and if there it should flutter from branch to branch, he must renounce all hope of making it figure in that famous tin box, in which it would be the most precious jewel. Alas, that was what happened. The manticore had rested again on the ground. Cousin Benedict, having the unexpected hope of seeing it again, threw himself on the ground at once. But the manticore no longer walked, it proceeded by little jumps. Cousin Benedict, exhausted, his knees and hands bleeding, jumped also. His two arms, his hands open, were extended to the right, to the left, according as the black point bounded here or there. It might be said that he was drawing his body over that burning soil, as a swimmer does on the surface of the water. Useless trouble, his two hands always closed on nothing. The insect escaped him while playing with him, and soon, arrived under the fresh branches, it arose, after throwing into Cousin Benedict's ear, which it touched lightly, the most intense but also the most ironical buzzing of its colopter wings. "Malediction!" exclaimed Cousin Benedict a second time. "It escapes me, ungrateful hexapode, thou to whom I reserved a place of honor in my collection. Well, no, I shall not give thee up, I shall follow thee till I reach thee." He forgot, this discomfited cousin, that his nearsighted eyes would not enable him to perceive the manticore among the foliage, but he was no longer master of himself. Vexation, anger, made him a fool. It was himself, and only himself, that he must blame for his loss. If he had taken possession of the insect at first, instead of following it, in its independent ways, nothing of all that would have happened, and he would possess that admirable specimen of African manticores, the name of which is that of a fabulous animal, having a man's head and a lion's body. Cousin Benedict had lost his head. He little thought that the most unforeseen of circumstances had just restored him to liberty. He did not dream that the ant-hill, into which he had just entered, had opened to him an escape, and that he had just left Alves's establishment. The forest was there, and under the trees was his manticore, flying away. At any price, he wanted to see it again. See him, then, running across the thick forest, no longer conscious even of what he was doing, always imagining he saw the precious insect, beating the air with his long arms like a gigantic field spider. Where he was going, how he would return, and if he should return, he did not even ask himself, and for a good mile he made his way thus, at the risk of being met by some native or attacked by some beast. Suddenly, as he passed near a thicket, a gigantic being sprang out and threw himself on him. Then, as Cousin Benedict would have done with the manticore, that being seized him with one hand by the nape of the neck, with the other by the lower part of the back, and before he had time to know what was happening, he was carried across the forest. Truly, Cousin Benedict had that day lost a fine occasion of being able to proclaim himself the happiest entomologist of the 5 parts of the world. Chapter 16. A Magician. When Mrs. Weldon, on the 17th of the month, did not see Cousin Benedict reappear at the accustomed hour, she was seized with the greatest uneasiness. She could not imagine what had become of her big baby. That he had succeeded in escaping from the factory, the enclosure of which was absolutely impassable, was not admissible. Besides, Mrs. Weldon knew her cousin. Had one proposed to this original to flee, abandoning his tin box and his collection of African insects, he would have refused without the shadow of hesitation. Now, The box was there in the hut, intact, containing all that the savant had been able to collect since his arrival on the continent. To suppose that he was voluntarily separated from his entomological treasures was inadmissible. Nevertheless, Cousin Benedict was no longer in José Antonio Alves's establishment. During all that day, Mrs. Weldon looked for him persistently. Little. Jack and the slave Halima joined her. It was useless. Mrs. Weldon was then forced to adopt this sad hypothesis. The prisoner had been carried away by the trader's orders, for motives that she could not fathom. But then, what had Alves done with him? Had he incarcerated him in one of the barracks of the large square? Why this carrying away, coming after the agreement made between Mrs. Weldon and Negoro, an agreement which included Cousin Benedict in the number of the prisoners, whom the trader would conduct to Mossames, to be placed in James W. Weldon's hands for a ransom? If Mrs. Weldon had been a witness of Alves's anger, when the latter learned of the prisoner's disappearance, she would have understood that this disappearance was indeed made against his will. But then, if Cousin Benedict had escaped voluntarily, why had he not let her into the secret of his escape? However, the search of Alves and his servants, which was made with the greatest care, led to the discovery of that molehill, which put the factory in direct communication with the neighboring forest. The trader no longer doubted that the fly hunter had fled by that narrow opening. One may then judge of his fury, when he said to himself that this flight would doubtless be put to account, and would diminish the prize that the affair would bring him.